This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Our guest is Greg Muttitt, author of Fuel on the Fire, Oil and Politics in Occupied Iraq. His book took about a decade of research. Naomi Klein called it nothing short of a secret history of the war. Greg Muttitt, talk about the oil law.
Okay, well, this was really the center of the story over the struggles over oil. The oil corporations wanted to wait until there was a permanent government in Iraq so that they could have secure contracts. The first permanent post-Saddam government was formed in May 2006 under Nouri al-Maliki. And in the months, even the months before that, the US, Britain, the International Monetary Fund were saying your first priority has to be to pass an oil law to give multinationals the leading role in Iraq's oil industry again, for the first time since the nationalization of the 1970s. And then this oil law was drafted very quickly after the government was formed. It was drafted in a couple of months by August 2006. As well as putting multinationals in the driving seat, its other role was to deprive their contracts of parliamentary scrutiny. According to existing Iraqi law, if the government signs a contract with a company like BP or Exxon to develop an oil field, it has to show it to Parliament to get the yes or no or amendments. And one of the major functions of the oil law was to repeal that existing legislation and so allow the executive branch, which was of course populated by US allies, to sign contracts without Parliament getting in the way. So this was the function of the oil law. It was drafted by August 2006, and the US had hoped it would pass very quickly without anyone knowing about it, because the vast majority of Iraqis are very keen that oil stays in Iraqi hands in the public sector. It didn't turn out that way. In October 2006, 2 months after it was drafted, the draft started to leak out. And in December 2006, I attended a meeting of Iraq's trade unions at which they decided they were going to fight the oil law. And so during the course of 2007, this became a central struggle over Iraq's oil. As you remember, Amy, in January 2007, President Bush announced a surge. He was sending an extra 30,000 troops into Iraq. Actually, that was one half of a two-part strategy. The troops were sent to achieve control over Iraq, and the second part of the strategy was to use that control, use that influence, to pressure Iraqi politicians to achieve what they called benchmarks. These were markers of political progress. And as you reported at the time, the foremost among these was getting an oil law passed. And so throughout 2007, there was constant pressure from the Bush administration on Iraqi politicians. But at the same time, the trade unions were organizing to try and stop this oil law because they thought it was going to be a disaster for the country. That campaign spread, and because of the strength of Iraqi feeling about it, over the subsequent months, the more it was talked about, the more people opposed it, and then the more it was talked about. And opposition to the oil law spread across the country. Civil society groups, both secular and religious, was talked about in Friday sermons in the mosques. And by the summer, this opposition spread into the Iraqi parliament. And politicians saw it as a political threat to their futures to support the oil law and an opportunity to get one up on their rivals by joining this popular cause. The Americans had set a deadline of September 2007 to pass the oil law or face a series of consequences, cutting off aid, removing military support to the Maliki government, etc. The September deadline came and the oil law wasn't passed. And the reason the oil law wasn't passed was because of this grassroots civil society campaign. Now, to me, that's a very inspiring story. It's why I feel hopeful about the future of Iraq, that operating in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, civil society was able to stop the USA achieving its #1 objective.
Talk then about Libya and Syria. We only have a few minutes, but in August of 2011, the New York Times reported, quote, "The fighting is not yet over in Tripoli, but the scramble to secure access to Libya's oil wealth has already begun." The article went on to name some of the oil firms in Libya, including BP of Britain, Total of France, Repsol YPF of Spain, U.S. companies like Hess, ConocoPhillips, Marathon. Talk about the significance of oil politics in Libya, and then what we understand about what's happening in Syria today.
Okay. Beginning with Libya, about 3 weeks into the military intervention in April last year. There was an interview I found quite surprising with the British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, in the Times newspaper. And the interviewer asked him, why is it we're intervening in Libya and not in Côte d'Ivoire? And at the time, Laurent Gbagbo was hanging on to power in Côte d'Ivoire, and the country was descending into civil war. He'd lost the election a few months earlier. And William Hague said, in both Libya and Côte d'Ivoire, we have a principled concern about democracy. The difference is, in Libya, we have interests. And those interests include, we don't want terrorist training camps in the desert. We don't want Libyan and African refugees getting into Europe, and so we want to stop that flow. But most importantly, if we didn't intervene, it would have terrible consequences for the price of oil. And this is quite a contrast with how the Iraq War was talked about. When I looked at this, it seemed that, in my analysis, the big concern was that it was oil behind a humanitarian concern. What they were worried about was that if Gaddafi had attacked Benghazi, as it looked like he was going to in March 2011, the international community would have felt compelled to apply sanctions to Libya, and taking about 1.5 million barrels a day of oil off the market would have constrained the market and then pushed up the oil price. So you see, it's a humanitarian concern in front, but an oil concern behind.
And finally, Syria.
On Syria, I think, you know, what I've really learned by studying Iraq since 2003 is that a lot of the people involved in the occupation genuinely believed they were acting in the interests of Iraqis. What they created was a complete disaster, and the reason they created a disaster was because there were constantly US interests behind it. All of the decisions were shaped by interests, even if people talked about them and thought about them in terms of, I'm sure this will help the Iraqis. The interests gave them a particular perspective of what they thought Iraqis needed and wanted. And the disaster came, as I say, because of US interests being involved, however well-meaning some of the individuals were. And so when people call now for, we must do something in Syria, the suggestion of a military intervention, I think it would be disastrous, simply because much as it would like to claim it is, the USA is not a neutral party in Syria any more than it is in Iraq, and it would steer the country down a route that would serve its interests.
Finally, is it too simplistic to say that the difference between Iraq before and after the U.S. war with Iraq is that before the oil was owned by the country, and afterwards the oil is now owned by private corporations or being profited off of by private corporations?
I'd say it's a little bit more complex than that, in that the oil law was never passed in 2007. It's still not passed today because of that civil society campaign. Without the oil law, the existing legislation is still in force, which says that contracts have to be approved by Parliament. The multinationals are there, they didn't show the contracts to Parliament, so technically they're illegal. Now, the trade unions have played a central role in fighting this fight. What it says to me is that although at on its face it looks like a victory for big oil, it's a temporary one. And a future Iraqi government, if they get a more representative and genuine Iraqi government, they couldn't get a less one, it could potentially tear up the contracts and say these aren't in Iraq's interests, and the companies wouldn't have a legal comeback against that.
I want to thank you very much, Greg Muttitt, for joining us, the author of Fuel on the Fire, Oil and Politics in Occupied Iraq. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.